with Allison Gingras, distributed through Breadbox Media. I am joined today by a very special guest. Her name is Lana Portolano. Did I say that correct? Whew. Everyone knows me and last names. We are going to have an amazing conversation today, which I'm so thrilled for you to be a part of. And I will have the closed captionings included when this goes to YouTube. And I'll tell you why. Well, that should always happen. But today is very special that this happens because we're talking about a book called Be Opened, The Catholic Church and Deaf Culture, out now from Catholic University
of America Press.
Of America Press. Thank you. I'm like, there's an A, and I can't remember what the A stands for. Lana, thank you so much for joining me today on A Seeking Heart.
Oh, I'm very happy to be here.
Well, let's start with this crazy godsidence. So I'm really good friends with Father Sean Carey, which you talk about in the book, and I know he's the one who told me to get Be Opened because my daughter Faith is adopted from China and she's profoundly deaf. But when I received the book and I reached out to you right away, it was still wrapped in the cellophane. So I had not yet opened it, which I also posted a picture of it yesterday with the irony that the book is Be Opened and mine wasn't. I didn't realize we share in common that we both have adopted daughters who are deaf. So tell me about your adoption story.
Correct. And first of all, about the title Be Opened, my editor made that joke early on about the title being a bit audacious, that I have a book title that commands people to open the book. But it really comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7. And it's the only moment in Scripture where Jesus communicates with a deaf person. In fact, it's the only place in all of Scripture where anyone communicates with a deaf person. So it's pretty special. And as for my adoption story, my daughter, who brought me into the deaf world, was 4 years old when she was adopted from Eastern Ukraine, from the area in Ukraine that is no longer a part of Ukraine as of recently. In fact, she was from a small orphanage in Lysychansk, which was recently occupied by the Russians. She had no hearing at equipment limits, and she is ethnically Roma and mixed with Ukrainian and Russian. And so she had been living with relatives until she was about 2, and then she found herself in a clinic and abandoned, and so then she went into the baby home, and the staff members there and my adoption facilitator, a wonderful woman who was helping us through this process, was afraid that she would be sent to the special orphanage or special school that they have for deaf in Kiev, and would not receive the education that she needed to receive. So it was kind of a need to adopt her quickly before that happened when she turned 5. So my husband and I traveled, and she thought that I would be a good parent for her because of my interest in language. And in fact, she was my first child aside from my stepchild, who was at that time 14. And so I became obsessed with giving language to this child in a very mother driven way. And so that influenced the course of my life for the next several years, and is still a part of my life today. The fact that she had no language at all, no sign,
Neither
nothing.
did my daughter. Nothing. No,
Yeah,
she gave the thumb up, and she'd kind of growl at you if she was upset. She was so frustrated. I don't know if your daughter was like, my daughter was so frustrated. Her behavior when we first got her home could be very unruly and very difficult. And it was just the frustration. I can't imagine not being able to tell somebody the simple thing, like I need to go to the bathroom, or I'm hungry, or I just want to go to bed. Like she had no way of expressing these things. it was like overwhelming. And I was so
Mhm.
grateful. I'm sure you feel this way too, that God would call you to such a beautiful mission to be a part of this amazing young woman's life. Like sometimes I think I hit the jackpot. She may not so much. She may have wanted to play another lotto card, but I hit the jackpot with her. And we actually, God had revealed to me that we would be adopting a deaf child in prayer 3 years before we actually were matched with her. So my sons and I, biological sons and I, had started taking American Sign Language. They were homeschooled at the time. To I knew I knew that this language was either this learning the language beforehand was either just going to be something wonderful to keep our time busy until we adopted, or I knew more strongly that this step out in faith and trust to learn this language so I could communicate or teach this child to communicate when we were matched with a deaf child would glorify God. And that is exactly what it has done. Now, we chose American Sign Language, but you chose a language that I've actually never heard of, cued speech. Can you tell me just a little bit about that? And then I want to dive a little deeper into the book.
Well, initially we chose ASL before we went on our adoption trip, and then later we switched to English via cued speech. So the language was actually English, and the mode of communicating the language was cued American English, and
Okay.
so but we didn't exclude signs. We had many friends who signed, and she added a full course of sign language by middle school. But I was very concerned that she have English without limits and be able to read without limits. So and also because it's my native language, I felt that I would be able to provide complete saturation in English if only she could receive it. So I met some deaf people who grew up using cued speech and had amazing written English skills and amazing reading skills. So I talked to them
Beautiful.
about it and began talking with others in that circle and decided to really commit to it. It's basically a system of 8 hand shapes. They look like this, like one, wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There we go. They're very simple hand shapes, and then the hand shapes paired with what the consonant looks like on the mouth makes a consonant sound or represents a consonant, and then the placement around, there are 4 placements around the mouth that represent a vowel. So basically it's a way of making visual phonics, a phonic system.
Oh, that is
And
so cool.
amazingly, it was invented by a man named Orrin Cornett at Gallaudet University in the 80s. And and so and at that time he tried using it with children, and it had brilliant results. It's not very popular in the deaf community because American Sign Language has a whole culture attached to it and a whole political and historical past that's very important to the deaf community. And
Yes.
many people it takes time to understand these kinds of things. Even sign language and how sign language works takes time to understand visually. So many people in the deaf community have some misconceptions about what cued speech is, or think that it would exclude learning sign language or that it would compete with sign language, and it doesn't. It just enables a deaf person who grows up with it. Kids, I cued everything that I said to Lana, and cued everything that everyone else said, and cued environmental sounds and
Wow.
everything, so that she just absorbed the language like any other kid would through regular use of the language
That,
in daily life.
that
And then
is
she was able to learn to read phonetically.
that's crazy and amazing. Like, because my daughter is now 16, she is cognitively disabled, mildly cognitively disabled. So her reading level is only like third grade. And I just think so. I see her struggling to learn the language, the written language of English.
Yeah.
So I just
Yeah.
find that very fascinating. But also, what's been really fascinating for us, and I'm sure for you, was teaching the faith. My daughter's actually named Faith. So teaching faith
Oh.
to faith, because it took all the faith I had in the world to take this
Mhm.
anxiety-ridden woman all the way to China to bring home a 3-year-old child who was deaf. So
Yeah.
for me, it was teaching her the language, the faith that I found a little bit more challenging because theology is a ology. So like the tangible. So it's just finding the tangible. In fact, my new book is Encountering Signs of Faith, and it is about our journey between adopting her and sharing the faith through the tangibles. So
Lovely.
our books are so beautiful tandem together.
Yeah. We
Um,
should go on a book tour.
I love this idea. I love this idea. We're gonna bring an interpreter, and we're gonna
Oh, wow. I
come.
can see
All
it
right,
already.
my wheels are turning, Lana. My wheels are
Mhm.
turning. But and it's been really difficult for us. We live in a very small diocese. In fact, she's the only known person I know that's the Catholic in my diocese who's deaf. And I know she's not the
Mhm.
only one, but she's the
Mhm.
only one we've encountered. And when God called us to adopt her, I started learning. Actually, Father Sean Carey is the one who taught me how to interpret the Mass.
Mhm.
So for forever, for the last 12 years, I have been her tie to the Mass. It was the blessing during the COVID shutdown is that we watched Father Sean's masses on YouTube, and she loved because the homilies made more sense to her. They were from her cultural perspective. They weren't interpreted. They were right from the priest's hands, and I love that. I wish he was just a squidge closer so we could go weekly to his masses. And I know some people would say, well, if you really you really stepped up and were mom of the year, you'd bring her. But anyway, I know I'm very difficult. I'm really hard on myself. But the whole idea of creating this community, like the Catholic Church is a community and deaf is a community, and bringing them together and share, you are so blessed to have a community so rich and active. Right? Is it near you, or are you the good mom who drove the
Yeah,
hour to bring?
well, we lived around the Washington, D.C. area, so there's a very active deaf community because of Gallaudet University, and there's also a large deaf population centered around the two Maryland School for the Deaf campuses. So in Frederick, there are quite a lot of deaf people. There are just a lot of deaf people in Maryland and in D.C. Um, and my child really, I really wanted her to have deaf role models because even though I was a good language model for her in English, she needed deaf role models who were adults who could show her what was possible for deaf people, anything. You know, and so I wanted to expose her to a lot of deaf culture, all different kinds. And also, yes, I wanted her to have the faith, so I needed good role models for her who were deaf and who were Catholic. And so we found that at St. Francis of Assisi Deaf Catholic Church in the Archdiocese of Washington, and there was a deaf priest there at the time, Father Joe Bruce. He's a Jesuit, and there were other hearing priests, and many, just so many wonderful Catholic people who are my friends and my brothers and sisters now. And I, it was Lena who opened this world to me. She opened me, and I was able to see and learn so many things from the perspective of someone experiencing deaf culture and learning from this point of view. And I became fascinated with preaching and the mass itself in sign language. I'm a convert, and so I thank God that I was Catholic when Lena came to us, because the visual nature of the mass and the sign language of the mass that is full of signs and symbols is something that I think translates in a very special way in American Sign Language. And I think it's very profound because everything that you see in the Mass is a sign of God, and the Eucharist is a sign in a very special way, and it's real. And so, a deaf person's body signing is both a real human being and that's present there and is signing the meaning that the words from scripture and from the Mass that were given to us through God. So it's a profound thing to watch and to be a part of, and I love it very much, and it's always going to be part of me now.
Oh, I completely agree. I share in Encountering Signs of Faith the first time I had to interpret the Passion on Good Friday. And I mean, and unfortunately, a lot of people do watch. I love my church because I can squish all the way over to the side so she can see, but I'm not, impeding people from the most important part of the Mass that's happening with Jesus in the Eucharist. But I was like interpreting, and you're like, your whole body is involved, and you're living this through your hands, through your face, through your body.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to hold back the emotion of it was just overcoming with me. And people will come up to me later and say, oh my goodness, you get so into that. And like, no, this is the language. The language is just
Mm-hmm.
expressive and beautiful. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't being theatrical. I was using American Sign Language. I was communicating this amazing moment in the gospel to my daughter. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just such a gift. And I mean, and I am a clumsy, like my daughter will tell me all the time, Mom, I love that you try so hard, but you're not the best signer. And I get it, because it's not my native language. Like,
Right.
it is not. So I love when I get to be part of the Mass with native American Sign Language users, because it is glorious. It is just, and to watch Father Sean, uh, you know, celebrate the Mass. One of the things I noticed just recently that I don't know how I missed it before, but when he does the gospel, he actually blesses his forehead, his mouth, his heart, and the palms of both of his hands, which is
Mm-hmm.
just these
It's
little things.
beautiful. It's beautiful. I don't see why that wouldn't be something that all deaf people, even while doing the Mass, would do. I mean, hearing people do like this. So, occasionally I have done it just to see what
Yes.
it felt like,
I have to say, I have too. I've added it since seeing him do that. If I'm going to interpret the gospel, of course, I want to bless my hands. So, Be Open, the Catholic Church and Deaf Culture. Why this book, Lana? Why? I mean, it is a beautiful, talk about inclusive. You talk about history, you talk about the current culture and evangelization. Like, I think you've covered everything, and it's such a great, engaging read. But why did you feel called to write Be Opened?
Well, when the idea first occurred to me, I thought that it was going to be about preaching the gospel in sign language, and particularly homiletics. I was fascinated with how the audience, or I'm sorry, Father Sean Carey would say the assembly. He corrected me about that early on. But my background is in rhetoric, so I always see the group of people who are listening as an audience. But in church, we have an assembly or a congregation. But the way that a deaf assembly is just hanging on they're so caught up in a really good homily, in a way that many times hearing people are not, even with a really good homily. And it's because they are physically involved in receiving that language and in a very different and spatial way. And also because language and communication is so precious in the ASL culture, in deaf culture. Anyway, I was fascinated by that because my background is in rhetoric and communication in a cultural context. But once I started studying that, then the other side of me that's a historian kicked in, because it was just a much bigger story, and it was a story that begged to be told. It's not only about ASL and preaching in sign language or doing the mass in sign language, although the whole books can be written about either one of those things. It was a story about um, sign language and deaf culture in the church, from all the way back, really all the way back to scripture, in that moment that I talked about when Jesus actually communicated with the deaf person. But in the Middle Ages, and when there were monastery schools in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then the flourishing of sign language in France, all the way up to contemporary times, there were connections between people and between things they had written, between their ideas, their philosophies of education, individuals like Laurent Clerc, who moved from from France to America and had such a profound effect on deaf culture as a founding father of deaf culture in the United States. All of that has to do, it's part of church history and the impact of the church in culture. So I think that deaf culture it's so much a part. The church history and deaf culture are really linked inseparably, and so I wanted to really focus on that, and show the connections across time, and that I thought argued for itself historically that because deaf people have this historical connection with each other, because they share a language or a family of languages. They have arts and religion that are signed, and all of this points to its being really a cultural group, and because of that, then the church needs to be aware of that, and to understand it as this particular culture is included in evangelization.
I could not agree more. The idea of including them in evangelization, and I love that my diocese, the person that our secretariat of the new evangelization, has already reached out to me and said, "I don't know enough about this, and I want to be better at it. We need to have a conversation." I thought that was just so beautiful of him, and really forethought, and I was just, I don't know, I just love my little diocese. So we're coming to the end of our time, and I'm going to put my little marketing hat on for a minute, and I'm going to think about the consumer who sees this book and says, "I don't have anybody deaf in my life. Tell me," and I know, because I didn't either at some point in my life, and I've read the book, so I know how important this is, as you just explained, for the Catholic culture, for the Catholic Church. This is part of our faith. But what would you say to somebody who said, "Well, that's a great book, but I don't really know anybody deaf. Should I read it?"
Anyone who is interested in church history or in mission activity, the book is chock full of missionary stories that are really exciting, and having to do with going to the margins of culture in many different countries around the world and doing really heroic things. So there are terrific stories that come from the deaf community, and really are described in so that hearing people can read about them in this book. And I think that it doesn't matter if you have someone in your life who is deaf or not, that the stories themselves are carry themselves. They're interesting stories. I mean, it's a university press book, and it's a kind of a dense history. So it's a book for people who are really interested in serious church history. There are pieces like the part in the beginning about my daughter that really especially will appeal to people who are connected to the deaf community. But I think it's a good introduction to the deaf community too. And so it's just wonderful to see things from a different perspective. And the church, the whole church belongs to every one of us who are Catholics. So the richness of the Mass and Sign Language and prayer traditions and this aspect of the cultural history belongs to us as hearing people as much as it belongs to the different deaf communities around the world. And it's something that unites us in a way that deaf people can be separate. So communities of deaf people often, because of necessity, because of their language, are often separate in a lot of ways from hearing people, and it goes two ways because the hearing world excludes them and then doesn't know anything about them because they don't understand sign language and they're different. But the Catholic Church is inclusive, and so I think that one of my aims in writing this book was to show that this is part of us. This is part of who we are as Catholics.
I absolutely loved this book. I think I'm a history buff as well and an English major. So maybe that's why, again, we have more in common. And I want to just encourage everyone that if your parish has a library, buy a copy of Be Opened and add it to the church library. If you're looking for your next present for your pastor who wants to evangelize to everyone, like he's given his life to bring people closer to Christ. And imagine if you give them this tools to know more about a culture that perhaps he hasn't yet been introduced to. By Be Opened, the Catholic Church and Deaf Culture, from my guest today, Lana Portolano. Did I do it right again?
That's
Okay.
right.
Woohoo! The Catholic University of America Press. I will have links to where you can purchase this. And I also will have a link. I love that in here, Lana, that you share that there is a companion website to your book, icfdeafservices.org, Be Opened. So I will make sure that gets linked as well to our show notes. Lana, thank you so much for making time this morning to spend time with us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
You have been listening to A Seeking Heart with Allison Gingras, distributed through Breadbox Media. God bless.